Question: who in his right mind threatens to start war in the middle of a global pandemic? Answer: a war-mongering zealot, or in this case, US President Donald Trump, aided and abetted by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien. As the coronavirus pandemic wreaks havoc on world economies, claims tens of thousands of lives, and cripples healthcare systems worldwide, US President Donald Trump took to Twitter last Wednesday to threaten to attack the Islamic Republic of Iran. Unsatisfied with the global pandemic and an economic collapse, Trump wants to add a major war into the mix. However, at such hard times globally, the US president is choosing to put his army presence in West Asia on the path of war as he continues to snub the consequences of his actions. The Iran Foreign Ministry replied to Trump's threats, calling for an immediate halt to warmongering during the coronavirus outbreak, as US forces reportedly deployed Patriot missiles to Iraq. Apparently, strangling Iranian civilians by imposing ridiculously cruel economic sanctions on their country isn't enough for the Trump administration. This only proves that the ruling administration in the US does not seem to prioritize even its own national interests, but instead the narrow interests of a governing party. However, this time the outcome of such irresponsible policies and behavior will not be limited to Iran. The US will also be inflicting harm on the American public. Why? Well, in order to better confront the new global crisis, the path to pursuing national interests when dealing with a virus that knows no borders is not separate or contrary to that of global interests and international accountability. So let's be honest here. It is not in the US's national interest for the coronavirus pandemic to become permanent. Thus, removing sanctions should be Trump's first move instead of continuous repulsive rhetoric against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Welcome to the Mideastream. I'm Marwa Osman. President Donald Trump increased his rhetoric against the Islamic Republic of Iran against what he said was a possible sneak attack that Iran was planning against U.S. occupation troops in Iraq. Now, Trump indicated in a tweet that the U.S. had information about a possible attack without citing any evidence. To discuss this issue with us from Texas is Mark Denkoff, who is a radio broadcaster and a journalist. Thank you for being with us, Mark. I know it's a bit early, so thank you for being with us there. Now, President Donald Trump tweeted last week without citing any evidence that Iran is planning some sort of a sneak attack against U.S. troops in Iraq. He said it's either Iran or its proxies, namely speaking here about the PMU, the Popular Mobilization Units, which are basically, according to the Iraqi law, part of the Iraqi armed forces. Now, what is the plot here? Is he plotting maybe to scare the PMU, which so far did not work, or what else?
Well, it's been clear that Donald Trump has been doing the bidding of Israel throughout in terms of his foreign policy. And of course, this situation goes back a long ways with a series of American presidents. But Trump has intensified all of this, it seems to me, since the 3rd of January with the illegitimate and illegal assassination of General Soleimani. From that time, his rhetoric has only gotten worse. And it seems that in this particular case, that Trump is still yielding to a lot of Israeli pressure on this whole issue of trying to, and pardon me for this pun, trump something up against the Iranians in order that the United States can continue to maintain its own illegitimate presence in Iraq, its own illegitimate presence in Syria, in a situation where the United States, in the middle of this COVID-19 situation, has a government that apparently is not even concerned about its own inabilities to take care of its own people with this pandemic, which is basically what I said to the Tasnim news agency of Iran in an interview that was published today.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is definitely where it started, what you mentioned, when Washington assassinated Lieutenant General Qasem Soleimani in Iraq in the first week of 2020. This prompted an attack, a retaliatory attack by the Iranians with a barrage of missiles against the Assad base, which is an Iraqi base being occupied by American forces. Does Donald Trump really want to see this replicate? Is he ready for such a caliber of a mistake again?
I would like to think that the president is not capable of doing anything again as irresponsible and as idiotic as the assassination of General Soleimani on the 3rd of January. But at this point, I suppose that anything is possible. It's important to remember that this entire business with the United States invading Iraq was based on a pack of lies to begin with in regard to this weapons of mass destruction argumentation that was offered to the American public back in 2003. Pat Buchanan said at the time that the United States would win the conventional phase of this war and proceed to lose the occupation. And that's precisely what's going on in Iraq. The United States is floundering in Syria, thanks to President Putin's legal intervention on behalf of the Assad regime against these Sunni Wahhabic extremists that the United States and Israel and Saudi Arabia and Turkey had introduced into the region. So in this entire situation, the American public, I would presume, is getting increasingly sick of this and now understands that with what has happened in this COVID-19 situation, its government has not been able to provide the basic equipment that its medical professionals need in order to protect human life. This is how bad this is. And of course, it makes the American foreign policy look even worse than it already is.
And it actually just tells the American public that we're ready to pay billions of dollars for a new war, but not for your health. And this is exactly what the U.S. Treasury Department tried to do by imposing new sanctions, which might actually escalate into a war. They imposed new sanctions against 20 companies last week, which they are claiming that they've been helping the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. This is just added to a list of vast, cruel economic sanctions that are, to be honest, just suffocating the regular Iranian here. And at such hard times, you just think that the globe is being hit by an epidemic, then everyone should be on board to ease any sort of sanctions to allow this fast containment of this very cruel virus. Yet the opposite is happening. What is going on with the Trump administration?
Well, again, I think the Trump administration is a tool of the Zionist state of Israel. It's also a tool of the multinational corporations who may feel that they have a vested interest in continuing to steal both land on behalf of Israel and resources on behalf of their corporations. This is the way that I would interpret this. And I think Congressman Ron Paul from Texas, the ex-congressman, is absolutely correct. These are war crimes. These sanctions are acts of war, and he was saying this correctly even before this COVID-19 thing got going. Basically, what you have is a situation where Iran abided by the JCPOA P5+1 treaty with both the United States and the other signatories to the deal, only to have Trump unilaterally pull out of this treaty and subsequently punish the Iranians with literally warlike economic sanctions, using Congressman Paul's words, because Iran abided by its end of the deal and the United States didn't. This is just how outrageous this is. And with this worldwide pandemic now, both in terms of lives, and money, and priorities, it reveals how morally and economically bankrupt the United States is going to prove to be, as its British Empire predecessor was when it finally vacated the Middle East and turned this mess over largely to the United States after World War II.
Well, that showed a bit of a bickering situation between the Pentagon and the Trump administration when 2 weeks ago the New York Times reported that Pompeo and National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien have argued that a hard response to Iran right now, meaning a war against Iran right now, while the corona pandemic is pummeling the country, would actually make its leaders more open to a negotiation. I don't know how they're thinking, but this is what they are saying. Yet we had a couple of U.S. Pentagon officials saying the absolute contrary of this and saying that this move would be catastrophic for the region. Now, really? Hitting Iran while it's struck with COVID-19, this is how they want to bring them to the table?
Well, obviously, these are criminal policies, and there's a criminal psychosis going on, it would seem, with both Pompeo and Trump, who were key players, obviously, in dreaming up this illegal, extrajudicial, criminal assassination of General Soleimani on the 3rd of January. You know, it used to be, and I think I said this in my op-ed on COVID-19 for Charles Bausman's Russia Insider earlier this week. It used to be that if the United States government undertook something that was criminal, which is not good, obviously, but they used to try to maintain what the CIA has always referred to as plausible deniability. In this particular case, what is so frightening about this is that between the domestic situation in the United States over COVID-19 and the fact that the American government is now openly committing crimes against humanity and crimes against international law, ranging from Soleimani's assassination to these COVID-19 sanctions on Iran, this is frightening. They're not even concealing what the agenda is. And I think it gets back to what Dr. Philip Giraldi, the former CIA station chief, who's now the head of the Council for the National Interest, has said, and that is these are crimes against humanity, these are war crimes, and again, they're made all the worse by this global pandemic, which is not simply a situation where presumably the United States feels no hesitation whatsoever in murdering Iranians or murdering Palestinians and people in Gaza. The United States at this point can be reliably seen as having a government that fundamentally does not care about the protection of its own citizens in terms of priorities. This is the most outlandish thing that I have seen, I believe, in my life.
This is really interesting, Mark. And before we end off, in just 1 minute, how do you think the American public will react to this? Will they accept a new war at these times?
Well, let me put it to you this way. If the American public accepts this on top of the lies about 9/11 and the earlier lies about Saddam Hussein and weapons of mass destruction, I would presume at this point they would accept anything. I am hopeful that the American public, now that all of this has come home to roost in their situation, both in terms of their health and survivability, physically and economically, that they're going to say enough is enough, that there will be a serious political backlash here. And I hope that that leads in the direction of getting the government of Israel out of its present position of running the foreign policy of the United States.
Well, I want to thank you very much from Texas, Mark Dankoff, radio broadcaster and journalist, for being with us. Thank you very much for your contribution to our show, and please stay tuned for our next segment. At least 2 people have lost their lives and several others sustained injuries when Turkish military forces and their proxy militants launched barrages of mortar shells at residential neighborhoods in the western sector of Syria's northeastern province of Al-Hasakeh. Turkey retains its aggression against Syria in this following report. At least 2 civilians have lost their lives and several others sustained injuries when Turkish military forces and their proxies mortar-shelled a residential neighborhood in the western sector of Syria's northeastern province of Al-Hasakeh. Syria's official news agency Sana reported that Turkish troops and their proxies targeted buildings in the villages of Qabr al-Saqr and Al-Abush, which lie in the Tel Tamer district of the province on Thursday, April 2, leaving 2 civilians dead and 4 others injured. The development came only a day after a family of 4 was injured after Turkish forces and their allied militants shelled their home in Rabiat village in Abu Rasin district in the same province. Separately, Turkish troops and their allies also fired mortar shells at Zarkan town and Muharmal village in the same district of Hasakeh province. The shells damaged residential buildings, but there were no reported casualties. Meanwhile, the Syrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs strongly condemned Turkey and its allied Takfiri militants for cutting off water supply to local residents in the country's northeastern city of Hasakeh and surrounding residential neighborhoods over the past week, depriving more than 600,000 Syrian citizens, mostly women and children, from drinking water. The Syrian Foreign Ministry then called on the Security Council to condemn the crimes being perpetrated by Turkish soldiers and to obligate Ankara to stop its violation of the international law and humanitarian principles, besides its support for terrorist groups wreaking havoc inside Syria. In the meantime, Turkey has reportedly deployed a US-made air defense system to Idlib as Ankara beefs up its military presence in the Takfiri-held Syrian region, despite a ceasefire reached with Russia earlier this month to halt the escalations. Now, to discuss the latest Turkish aggressions against Syria, with us from Beirut is Laith Marouf, who's a political commentator. Thank you very much for being with us, Laith. Now, Turkish troops and their proxies are firing at residential areas in the eastern province of Al-Hasakeh, mainly the Zarqan town and the Muharmel village in the Hasakeh province. At first, it was an Idlib incursion, and now it's back to harassing Hasakeh. What is Erdogan doing now?
He is continuing his role as a tool of the empire. He's been given that role to harass Syria and fill the gap of the collapse of the Wahhabi Contras. You know, in Idlib, we've had this ceasefire. He's now moving on to Hasakah again. But, you know, we don't know what's going to happen in the next few weeks. Coronavirus maybe is going to give us a small respite, but it's expected that we will be back to confrontation soon. Well,
last week also we saw Turkey dispatching new reinforcements to Syria's northwestern province of Idlib as well, because it seems that Ankara is beefing up its military presence in this embattled region, despite the fact that there was a ceasefire earlier this last month that both Moscow and Ankara put together to try and stop the escalations. But now it's all coming back. Do you think this ceasefire will actually hold up anymore?
I mean, for me personally, I think it is not going to hold up. It was a temporary ceasefire, basically, to make sure that things don't develop into direct war between a NATO member and the Syrian army and the Russian army that's backing it. I think this is just temporary. We're lucky kind of to have this coronavirus. I don't know how we can say it's lucky, but it is making people wait a little bit on more death for other reasons. But for sure, in the next month, there will be a return to hostilities. And the Turkish army, as you pointed out, has moved in thousands of new troops, hundreds of heavy artillery and air defenses, as you mentioned. And this is going to make the fight much more serious than before.
What's the point? I mean, what's the point if there was a ceasefire that would be maybe a pretext for an agreement to be put out later on to try and put out something of a political resolution to end this needless war in Syria?
There will be no political solution here, although this is what all the parties keep on talking about, other than the Syrian government, who's very clear that there is no political solution. Because what the West wants is a regime change in Syria, and specifically an end of Syrian support to anti-colonial, anti-imperialist resistance in the region and for the liberation of Palestine. And that is not going to happen because, you know, the only thing that keeps the government in place in Syria is that the Syrian people know that their government is sovereign and is anti-colonial and carries the flag of Arab liberation. So at this, you know, what we see in the future coming back is a direct confrontation. It has to happen at some point, and it will happen. Let's hope for the best, obviously.
Well, Syria has been concerned for some time now that Turkey has plans that include much more than just acquiring oil fields of its territory. We're speaking about the eastern part of the Euphrates, where actually there are U.S. troops that are also occupying these lands and looting Syria's crude oil reserves here. Is there a chance that we are actually looking at an agreement, a Turkish-American agreement to bilaterally loot what Syria has of crude oil?
Well, if you look at the map, you know, there's an exchange of roles between the United States, Israel, and Turkey. And you could see clearly that between the American troops in Al Tanaf region, the Turkish troops in the north, and the Israeli occupation of the Golan, you have a vice grip, you know, a military vice grip that is pushing towards the center of Syria. And to speak about the oil, the Turkish government and specifically the Erdogan regime has been looting the Syrian oil since the beginning. You know, if we remember,
as back as 2011.
Yes, so as you remember, the ISIS were looting the oil of Deir ez-Zor, Hasaka, and Raqqa, and they were sending it to Turkey to be sold, bought by the family of Erdogan.
But Erdogan denied that, despite the fact that there were footage released by the Russians showing miles and miles of trucks taking the oil into Turkey.
Exactly, and it doesn't matter his denial because the fact speaks for everybody to see, and this is still continuing. The Kurdish militias, the Contras that replaced the Wahhabi Contras in their work, have still been looting this oil under American occupation protection, and they've been shipping it to northern occupied Iraq. By the way, in North Iraq, there's over 20 somewhat Turkish military occupation bases in Nineveh. And that's where the oil is going. It's going to Nineveh, and from Nineveh going into Turkey, and again to the Jihan pumping stations on the Mediterranean and into the Israeli economy. So now we know that 90-somewhat% of the oil that Israel is consuming is coming from looted oil in both Syria and Iraq, where the Kurdish militias also in Iraq are still clients of the Zionist regime.
Well, that by itself, without any incursions, is actually an act of war. But we're seeing here that Turkish authorities also have interrupted water pumping in Syria several times now since the start of this year, with the latest interruption on March 29. It's documented on March 29. And by doing that, it's compromising humanitarian agencies' ability to prepare and to protect, and even national humanitarian agencies, we're talking here, to protect vulnerable communities, especially against the COVID-19 virus attack, the pandemic. Do you think this will actually have any effect on the Turkish-Russian agreement for halting Turkish aggression against Syria and maybe push forward towards an international outcry for Turkey to stop doing this, and especially led by Russia, to stop doing this and leave the civilians be?
The Turkish government has never cared for the civilians, neither in Syria or in Iraq or in Turkey itself. And we know that what we call the international community is really the Western imperialist powers, and they have never cared for 600 years for actually the civilians, whether the indigenous people of the colonized continents and or the decolonizing peoples. But to get back to your point here, the water being cut off of Hasaka is a war crime in itself, especially with this coronavirus pandemic. I mean, we hear every day everybody telling the civilians that they need to wash their hands over and over again. And here is 1 million people with no access to water. They can't even wash their hands, let alone be able to drink palatable water. So Turkey is squeezing the Syrian government, and we see that the Kurdish Contras that supposedly were in North Syria protecting civilians are doing nothing about it. So at the end of this pandemic, we should be expecting that there will be a return to hostilities, and we will see the Syrian government hopefully fighting for the rights of its civilians.
And definitely, maybe by trying to retake the land being occupied by any foreign entity. I want to thank you very much, Laith Maarouf, our political commentator from Beirut. Thank you very much for being with us. And please stay tuned next week for more from right here on the Mideastream